Thank you. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. We're very glad to be here presenting our talk titled, indeed, Low Energy to High Energy, Hacking Nearby EV Chargers over Bluetooth. And for us, this particular topic, we've found that over the last year, or this year, that there is about a generic three-step process that we could follow. The first step is to be in Bluetooth or Wi-Fi range of an EV charger, a level 2 one of the ones aimed at the home market. The second step is, well, it can involve multiple other steps. And then finally, we just execute arbitrary code on the charger. And we did that not once this year, not twice. We did that 3 times, as a matter of fact. But before we get into that, let's talk about a bit of an introduction. Who are we? So my name is Khaled Nassar. This is my colleague, Thijs Alkemade. And together with our colleague, Daan Keuper, who unfortunately could not be here today, we are security researchers working for Computest Security. Computest Security is an IT security consulting firm in the Netherlands that offers a wide number of services, from penetration testing to security monitoring. And there we specifically work for the research center called Sector 7. It was created a few years back with the overarching goal of helping improve the state of software security in the world. And generally, we do so by undertaking research projects, usually vulnerability research. And in the course of doing so, sometimes we participate in competitions. And particularly pertinent to this talk is our participation in the first edition of Pwn2Own Automotive that took place January of this year in Tokyo. The scope of this edition of Pwn2Own had, in the vehicle category, the EV vehicle category, was just the Tesla. Some third-party infotainment systems in the infotainment system category. Automotive operating systems were also in scope, like Android Automotive, as well as automotive-grade Linux, AGL. And finally, the category that we focused on the most, EV chargers. Generally, targets that were in that category fell in the level 2 charger classification, which provide a bit more power. They are a bit faster than level 1 chargers that you might get if you buy an AV from a manufacturer. But they're still targeted at the home market, although they do usually require a bit more power and setup. And generally, they come with a standard set of features. They have some form of connectivity to talk to the vendors' servers in the cloud, usually over Wi-Fi or Ethernet, and many of them use Bluetooth or Bluetooth Low Energy to provision the charger to get on the user's Wi-Fi access point. They usually also have some companion app made by the vendor that provides charging scheduling, as well as power and usage monitoring. And this category for us was relatively new. So we had to undertake a bit of reconnaissance first to figure out what kind of targets are we going to go for in the competition, as well as which ones should we prioritize. And we had to assess that based on our own understanding and estimation of attack surface. So let's start by with the first case, the Juicebox 40, which for us was perhaps the most interesting from the point of view of that online initial reconnaissance target prioritization point. From the brochure, as far as we're concerned, we're mainly looking at attack surface at this stage to figure out whether we're going to target it or not. The charger has 2 main interfaces. It uses BLE, which is mainly for provisioning. And after it's been provisioned onto the user's access point, it is on Wi-Fi, and the attack surface basically becomes network-facing. And like the rest of the chargers, it's also a level 2 charger aimed at the home market. And this is all there is in the brochure. There's another charger that we're going to talk about later, which did actually have some publicly available security reports from a few years back, but this one did not. It was still interesting for us from the reconnaissance point of view because we actually found a lot of information about it online. For example, we found release notes from the vendor mentioning software versions and a specific real-time operating system that this charger was running. We also found iFixit articles listing out the models over the years and the different hardware platforms that they used. But we also found some Reddit posts with users talking about how they troubleshooted some problems. And this comment in particular was very interesting to us. So this user here is talking about over Wi-Fi, they were able to connect to some command line interface over Telnet over port 2000. More interestingly, there is no password. It's unauthenticated. And it allowed a long list of commands. And they even provide a link to that list of commands from the manufacturer or the maker of the operating system that this charger is running. Another user also mentioned that this exact same interface is available in web mode in a web configurator. For us, this was just enough to shift our view about the attack surface of the charger and made us think, OK, hey, this is actually quite a bit. So let's just order it. And of course, the charger is aimed at the US market, so we had to wait for it to show up at our offices in the Netherlands. In the meantime, we decided, let's go take a look at the platform behind it, called Zentry. So we went and took a look at the platform, tried to understand how it works, what it is about. And we learned very quickly on that Zentry was the name of the company, an earlier company that made a turnkey IoT solution, hardware and software and OTA management, device management, et cetera, which was later bought by Silicon Labs and slightly rebranded into Gecko. So we learned that the juice box is probably based on this module called the WGM160P. It's a Wi-Fi module, ARM processor. And it runs on a real-time operating system called GeckoOS. And it's important to note that at the time we did this research, GeckoOS was actually end of life already. But interestingly, Zentry also has a device management platform called the DMS. And we found out that we could simply register a test account there, make some test products, and even select different versions of GeckoOS that they support. And once we did that, we were able to download firmware blobs, including the base parts of the operating systems, the kernel, the plugins, et cetera. So we started investigating those, and we did so before the device had even arrived in our office. And we started off looking for common suspects, memory corruption, vulnerabilities, issues with string mishandling, et cetera. And we very quickly ran into the vulnerability that would actually form the basis of our Pwn2Own attempt. So a bit of context around this is that GeckoOS has a message logging facility. It logs certain messages when certain event types occur. These messages are based on templates, and it is possible for users or applications using the API to modify these templates. You can just send the set variable command. This is available through that terminal command line interface. Every message is limited to 32 characters, including a null byte terminator, so actually it's only 31 characters. And it supports formatting tags that start with an @ sign and then a lowercase character. And per event type, there are different potential formatting tags that can be used, but one that can be used across of all of them is @t, which is replaced by a timestamp dynamically. So while looking for issues with SNPrintf usage, we quickly found a vulnerability in the routine that formats and then logs these messages to the logging interface. Looking and just zooming in on a small part of that just to highlight what the vulnerability is, the routine allocates a buffer on the stack, 192 bytes long, and it uses that to format into it the message that it is going to log eventually. And as it goes over the template and using the data that it has, the dynamic data, it goes ahead and changes every placeholder for the actual value that it is. So looking just at @t here to highlight what the issue is, once it hits @t, it goes ahead and generates a timestamp in a string format, takes about 23 bytes using a series of mem copies and some modifications. And it does absolutely no checks whatsoever as to whether it's still within bounds of the stack allocated buffer or it has gone out of bounds afterwards. It just moves the pointer in the buffer 23 positions ahead every single time. So how could this go wrong? Well, what if we provide multiple @t tags? We can provide up to 15 of them, so 30 characters. Every one of those will use 23 bytes. That's 345 bytes in total. We only have 192 bytes available on in the buffer on the stack. We're way past this, and we're into the out-of-bounds area. We've probably overwritten saved registers and saved PC. Now, this routine had a few issues in a few different places, and It depended on the tag, but it's a bit complicated, so we can't really go into it because of time constraints. But we are going to talk about it in our blog posts that will be published on our website, so check them out if you're interested in the details. But back to our session title for a second. This is all happening over Wi-Fi, right? But we said BLE, so what gives? Well, there's a secondary processor for BLE on the device as well that communicates with the main application processor over SPI. And it actually exposes a serial interface, more or less. And it has some interface that allows a similar interface to the command line interface that we have, setting and getting variables. Some of these variables are also global OS variables and related to the application, like, for example, the Wi-Fi credentials. So if you could communicate with the device over BLE, which makes sense in the provisioning state, you're using it to set Wi-Fi credentials, but you can also get the pre-provisioned Wi-Fi credentials of the device. But BLE is turned off once the device is provisioned. So how do we get that back? Well, the answer turns out to be pretty simple, just deauthenticate it from the AP that it's connected to. Once you do that, after a short period of time, it'll fall back into provisioning mode, and you're back in BLE again, and there you go, you have it. So this bug and quite a few others were also reported in GeckoOS in Pwn2Own. And the vendor has actually published an advisory for it since. So what is the fix that they offered for GeckoOS? Well, actually nothing, because GeckoOS is already end of life. So the fix is no fix. And this ends our foray into the juice box. And I'm going to move to Thijs to talk about the Autel Maxi Charger.
Yes, I'm going to talk about our exploit for the Autel Maxi Charger. From all of the 3 chargers that we exploited, this one had the most luxurious feature set. So not only does it have Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, it also has a 4G module with a SIM card included even. It has Ethernet. It has RFID, so you can just use it with normal charging cards that can be issued. It has an LCD touchscreen and a RS485 port for communication between chargers for load balancing. And we also found out that it runs a free RTOS-based operating system. One other feature that was very interesting about this charger is that it supports home charger sharing, as they call it. You can basically make your charger public, which means that anybody else can use it while you're not using it. And you get reimbursed for the money that well, you had to spend on the energy for that. So this is a very interesting feature to keep in mind later when we talk about the impact of these vulnerabilities. So for the Autel, basically the most challenging part for us was getting the firmware. That took us quite a lot more time than actually writing these exploits. So we looked at how the device is updated. We found that that's mainly done by the mobile app. So you first need to pair a mobile app, then the mobile app downloads a new firmware, sends it over Bluetooth to the device. So we intercepted the traffic. We thought, let's just grab those URLs and download those files. But it wasn't that easy. So the response that we got back from the cloud when we asked for firmware updates had an obfuscated URL. So the finfo field here, that's actually the URL, but it has been obfuscated. So we tried for a while to see if we can hook into the app to see how the encryption procedure worked. All turned into a mess, didn't work, and then we looked at it a bit more carefully. We thought it looks a lot like base64, but it's not correct. But then we compared, we looked at what it actually decoded, and we saw that half the characters looked correct. And then by just guessing what would the character be here, and then comparing that to the actual base64 we had, we realized it was just something really stupid. They were just replacing capital letter A with lowercase a for a couple of different characters in 7 and Y and stuff like that. And that took us a couple of days to figure out. Pretty embarrassing. But then we could download those files. And they were still obfuscated. So we got another layer of obfuscation here. And as you can see by the entropy, they're clearly not properly encrypted. There's, if you look at them in a hex viewer, you also see patterns. It's probably not really readable, but there's a pattern that just repeats every 256 bytes here. So our first guess is, well, it's probably a XOR with some 256-byte key, but that just gave us garbage, whatever key we tried. And then we tried maybe it's addition instead of XOR, and that also didn't really work out. But eventually we figured out that it's a combination of XOR and an addition, and we had to really puzzle to figure out, basically in the same method of just guessing a few characters, and then that generates some equations that you can then later solve, and eventually you have the two 256 bytes keys that we could use to get the actual firmware. Now this was like 2 days of filling in a very large crossword puzzle to get the actual firmware properly decrypted, and then we could actually start looking for vulnerabilities in the code. So for the Autel, the pairing process is pretty complicated. The other ones you just connect over Bluetooth and you can do anything you want. This one actually has authentication. So first, if you want to connect to your charger, you need to register it to your account. And you do that by scanning a QR code from the manual with a serial number and 8-digit code, submit it to the cloud server. If that charger is not yet registered and the code is correct, it gives you an authentication token. And then there's some kind of handshake with the charger where both the charger and the app pick a random number, and then they hash that together with the authentication token, and the charger says either this is correct, and then you can send all Bluetooth management messages, or it just says it failed and it disconnects you. And we're looking at this process in our decompiler, and we saw, well, this is the comparison for when it compares the hash that it received with the hash that it itself generated. And it's based on, the authentication token is generated by the charger based on something like the serial number and some other tokens specific to the charger. But then we looked further in the flow of this function. We saw that the same process appears to be happening a second time. But that second time, it wasn't using something that was charger specific. It was using a token that was hard-coded into the firmware. And it's probably not really clear if you see the flow like this, but I'll highlight this specific message. This happens when you use that authentication token in the firmware. And they say auth BD suck. Now, I don't really know for sure what BD stands for, but we really think they just intended this as a backdoor in their Bluetooth authentication functionality. So once you have connected to the charger, there's quite a lot of messages you can send. You can basically manage the entire charger over Bluetooth. And there's a lot of different handlers for different messages. And we went through them, and one of them stood out immediately because there was a stack-based buffer overflow. There's a specific message. We're not sure exactly what it's used for, but it's some charging control parameters, as you can see at the bottom. But if you send that message, the entire Bluetooth message is copied into a 60-byte stack buffer without verifying the length. So that message can be any size. It can be many times more than your 60 bytes. And with this, you're just directly overflowing the stack. And similar to the juice box, there are no mitigations here. There's no stack canaries, there's no ASLR. You're not limited on character set in this case because it's a Bluetooth message. There's a lot of saved registers on the stack. So I think writing this exploit took us only like a morning, all three of us working on this together. The only bit of a tricky part here is that because it's an RTOS, you cannot just exit the process because then the entire thing crashes. There's no processes. So you need to properly clean up everything and make sure that it keeps running. Otherwise, you don't really know if it actually worked. So we had to make sure that everything continued properly. So we had found this, and we moved on to other targets because we still had other things we hadn't hacked yet. But then, as the competition was actually coming up, we realized that, yeah, this was a pretty shallow bug. That's pretty likely that other teams will have found this as well. We can't really avoid the Bluetooth authentication part, but maybe we can find a little bit more subtle vulnerability for the second part. And eventually we found something in the OCPP connection. So OCPP is a standard that's used a lot within the EV charging sector for communicating with chargers and for communicating between different providers for things like roaming for using a charging card on a different charger. And those messages are basically, it's WebSockets over an HTTPS connection, and they are decoded as JSON. And in this specific message, we really don't know what it is for because we don't have any actual example of this message. But it receives some data that it base64 decodes, and again, into a stack buffer of a fixed size without verifying the length. In this case, it's 1024 bytes, and it just decodes it without any checks. And we're a lot happier with this bug because it's a lot more subtle. You need to change the OCPP connection configuration. You need to, it's not directly calling memcopy, so it doesn't stand out as much. So we were a lot happier with this one. And indeed, it did not collide during the competition. Now I'm going to hand over to Khaled to talk about the ChargePoint Home Flex.
Yep, thank you. So the ChargePoint Home Flex. So once again, for us from an attack surface point of view, the charger interface-wise has Bluetooth and Bluetooth Low Energy, mainly for provisioning, once again, Wi-Fi. But for this one, we actually had a bit more information. So we happen to know a bit more about the CPU that it runs, as well as the fact that it runs Linux. And why did we know that? Well, for this one, there is a public security report that was published by Kaspersky Labs back in 2018. And it's quite a detailed report. They really go over their entire process from dumping NAND flash of the CPU all the way to the network-facing vulnerabilities that they found, as well as a bug they found in BT Classic, another stack buffer overflow. So there's a message handler when the user is provisioning the device to connect to a Wi-Fi endpoint. They have to provide an SSID and a password. The password is copied into too small of a buffer. It's the same story. So of course, we followed their tracks a little bit, and we checked out what they did. The network-facing attack surface was pretty much closed off. That was pretty well cleaned up. BT Classic was fixed as well. But there is another one, another service called Onboard EE that was responsible for Bluetooth Low Energy message handling. So we checked that one out a little bit, and we saw where it is handling messages coming from the user's BLE device. And we didn't find a stack buffer overflow this time. But we didn't really see it configuring WPA supplicant or anything else of the sort. So we took a bit of a look around, and we ended up figuring this particular part out. So it turns out there's another application another service called WLAN app, also runs as root. Everything runs as root on this device, that is responsible for managing and configuring Wi-Fi connections using WPA supplicant. And what happens is Onboard EE gets the message. It uses some custom IPC mechanism built into the OS with a broker and everything. And it sends that over. WLAN app picks it up, and it goes ahead and builds a WPA supplicant configuration out of it. Now, for WPA2 access points, there is a passphrase, and usually that has to go through a key derivation in order to get turned into a pre-shared key. So how did WLAN app deal with that in WPA supplicant conf? Well, they use the WPA passphrase utility from WPA supplicant tools, but they just passed the parameters, the password in this case, just unmodified, unchecked, unsanitized from the user. So pretty straightforward command injection. It's used in the context of a shell. That's pretty much it. And once again, this is BLE, but when the device is provisioned on Wi-Fi, BLE is not enabled anymore. So once again, how do we get back to BLE? The answer is exactly the same as the juice box. You just deauthenticate it from the Wi-Fi AP back into BLE. And of course, we were under no delusion that this is a very shallow bug. We were pretty sure that other teams were going to find it as well. But we had more complicated bugs to work through, so we were really hoping for the luck of the draw that we would not be too late. But Tokyo and Lady Luck had a completely different plan for us. We were 7th in the draw for this particular target out of 7 attempts. So it was looking pretty bleak for us. And we'd already collided on the juice box with another team earlier on. This was our second day of the competition. So we thought we'll do something different. And I'm going to hand over to Thijs to talk about the rest of the tale.
So as Khaled said, we were lost for this charger, and we had a really shallow bug. But also when we looked at what the other contestants did, we saw that the first one was a success, And then the second one, the third one, and the fourth one all had collisions. So we thought they must have some shallow bug as well. And because the previous research used a stack buffer overflow in the same place, we thought they definitely must have had the same bug as we did. But we were on the last day. So we basically had an afternoon, evening, night to still find a new bug. Because the way Pwn2Own works is that you just register for a target. You don't need to specify in advance what your bug is going to be. If you show up with a completely different bug, that's entirely fine for them. So we thought, what other attack surface is there? Well, we looked at Bluetooth a lot, but yeah, we found what there is to find there. So it probably had to be on Wi-Fi. With Wi-Fi, we found pretty boring early on. There's basically two connections it makes outgoing to the internet. There's the OCPP connection using TLS as for TLTL, and there's an outgoing SSH connection, which is very interesting, but we're going to talk about that later. I'm going to focus on the OCPP connection. So for the OCPP connection, there was this configuration file we found with the URL and this interesting setting verify host name. So just based on that name, I sort of guessed that it probably refers to the curl option, SSL verify host, which is a well-known foot gun, so a dangerous setting in curl, because 0 means disabled, 1 means disabled but do some extra logging, and only 2 actually enables this setting, what looks like a Boolean. So this has been an issue in other projects as well. So Amazon has a payments service where this was an issue. And this is indeed what the charger ended up using. So they just specified that the certificate needed to be issued by a trusted root, not that it actually had to match the domain that you just saw. So if you got another certificate from ChargePoint's custom root CA, we could intercept the OCPP connection to the cloud. Thankfully, our charger had a certificate like that, because each charger also has a device-specific client-side certificate from the exact same root. So with our own charger's client-side certificate, we could intercept the connection to the cloud from a charger. Now, we had found this at like 11 p.m. the evening before our attempt, and this doesn't directly give us code execution on the charger, but it's such a powerful bug already that it was looking pretty likely that we might be able to find something new. And we sort of stayed up the entire night hacking on this, and this was only made possible because of this. Apparently, in Japan, in hotels, you can have vending machines that sell beer. That's not something you see in the Netherlands because of age restrictions. But with our change in this vending machine, we CTF style went through the night to find a new bug, and eventually we did. But what we were looking for something that had to be simple, clean. We didn't need to test it a lot because we didn't bring our own charger with us. That one was back in the office in the Netherlands, so that was 10,000 kilometers away from us, and we could log in on it remotely. But if we would crash it, we'd have to call somebody at the office and ask them, please go unplug the charger and replug it in again, which we can do, but at some point people would have gone to sleep and wouldn't work anymore. So we wanted something really simple, really clean, works on once, works immediately, not like a memory corruption or malicious firmware updates, nothing like that. So what are these messages on this OCPP connection? Well, they basically look like this. So there's a vendor-specific OCPP message for ChargePoint. And in the data, you see that third number, the 3508. This basically indicates what type of message it is, which is then handled to the IPC mechanism Khaled talked about to some specific daemon. And because all of this is spread out over many daemons that we hadn't looked at before, because why would we? It took quite a long time to really figure out every functionality that we can call within this binary. But eventually, at like 5 a.m. in the morning, we found this one. It's a message, I think it's called bank switch or B switch. And when this message is received, it directly passes a part of the message just directly into system. Pretty clean, pretty nice. Just one downside, the record reboot just above it already did a reboot command. So on Linux, if you reboot, it's going to terminate all of the processes. So you still have a few maybe a second or so to do something, but then it's definitely going to reboot, so reverse shell wouldn't work. Thankfully, the entire file system is just read-writable. We're running as root, so we could just inject a script somewhere that next time it booted, it would set up a reverse shell. And it worked. It was not a duplicate, so we had an actual new exploit, and it worked first time there at the competition. And I don't really know how other teams work, but I'm pretty confident in claiming that this was the fastest developed Pwn2Own exploit in recent years, with just 12 hours between finding the first vulnerability and actually demonstrating it on stage. That's really not how Pwn2Own works most of the time nowadays. Now, we get asked a lot about what is the impact of hacking EV chargers. And there's basically two main things you could do if you hack a charger. What we saw in the design, in the internal design of all of the 3 chargers, is that the connectivity module is separate from the power controller. So there's something handling Wi-Fi and something handling the actual charging process. And that one handles like the limit current, it checks the temperature and it starts throttling if it gets too hot. And if you could modify that firmware, you could actually damage the charger because of the safety checks. And at least for the Autel, we know that this firmware can actually also be updated. So the power controller can be updated from the other chip that we hacked. There's no signatures, nothing like that. If we just push out a malicious update that just disables all safety checks, we can push that to the charger, and then it no longer shuts down when it overheats. Secondly, if you have a charger with payment functionality, you could also hack it in order to charge for free, or if it's your own charger and somebody comes charging at your charger, you charge them for 10 times the amount of energy that he actually charged, and you get a lot of money instead of how much you actually spent. And that's also possible with this Autel home charger sharing functionality. Because with these chargers like this, it's actually only the charger that determines how much money you will be billed for. Because the car doesn't really know anything about your charging card, it cannot communicate that to the provider. And the charging card itself cannot communicate. So it's just the charger that knows how much you charged. And it's basically a payment terminal for making payments, which makes the level of vulnerabilities that we saw here pretty worrying. And finally, I'm going to give it to Khaled for some takeaways.
Thank you. So, throughout our work with EV chargers as well as IoT devices in general, we've had a couple of observations that we'd like to share, just to wrap up. So for most chargers, from what we've seen, there was quite a bit of attention that was paid to the network attack surface. There was not much there to find, really. But, well, that's a bit of a lie. We did find some stuff there as well, but it's still better than the rest. But attack surfaces that involve, let's say, unusual protocols, like Bluetooth, etc., we have found those relatively unexamined. But also specifically processes like provisioning and reprovisioning processes. There has been some issues with bad state transitions, so the provisioning process is supposed to go in a particular way with a particular transition from state A to state B, but it is possible that you can just go from state A to state C. There's not enough defenses in the programming of that to prevent that. But also, interfaces like Bluetooth, data just seems to be trusted under the assumption that, well, apparently attackers are not going to use that. But in our experience, this also seems to apply to so many IoT devices, and we think that at the very least for the provisioning or reprovisioning issue, which functionally makes sense and is relatively required, this should be taken into account earlier on in UX as well as security designs, and the attacker model has to be taken into account. So a charging unit that is mounted outside of your house should not go into reprovisioning mode if you just can de-authenticate it from the Wi-Fi AP it's currently connected to. There are, of course, other ways to do so, but we'll leave that for another time and for the developers and the awesome people working in this space. And with that, we are actually not done. There was something that we teased earlier. There was that SSH connection. So let's talk about what happened there. So One of the things that the charge point, so this is harkening back to the charge point home flex, one of the things that it had is it had this reverse tunnel to what they called the mothership in some init script that started early on. What this script did is that it basically did a port forward over SH. It had its own key that it could log into some remote server, but it was not allowed to actually get a shell, right? So you can only forward traffic over that SH connection, but you cannot get a login shell. Obviously, we used that, didn't really work, so we moved on from that part for a bit. But then at some point that evening when we started hacking, Thijs was looking at it again and made some interesting realizations. So this thing is used to essentially port forward the local telnet login shell from the charger itself to some other port on that server. We think it's used for some sort of maintenance mode. And it kind of looks like this. And that port that is allocated for the charger on the other end is from that script, seemingly based on the serial number of the charger and a few other things. So it just makes a calculation out of that. But one of the things we could do then, Thijs realized, is hey, I could just try to connect to another charger's remote interface, maybe. But this doesn't really help us get any closer to getting code execution on the charger in the competition. But we also don't really actually have the root password for the account for the root account, the password for the root account that's on the other end of the line. That's not very helpful. But we could do other things, like, for example, route to google.com, and that works. We could also, learning that this server is actually an EC2 instance running on AWS, check out its metadata service. And that worked, and it turns out that it has a role associated with it as well. And it has a very interesting name, CP, which we guess stands for charge point, production OTA servers role. Okay, and we got the access key and the secret access key. Now, what do you do once you have those? The very first thing you do is just check S3 buckets. Can you list some of them? Well, it turns out the answer is yes. And many of them had names like PII, prod, data lake. There's also CloudFormation templates and other configuration buckets, so this looked really interesting. And we also actually suspect this is not just for home chargers, but it might actually be the entire cloud infrastructure. And keep in mind that ChargePoint is one of the largest charging networks in the USA, with about 274,000 points globally. So, but for us, this is where we stopped, right? We didn't actually check if that role was allowed to pull data from the S3 buckets or not. We just stopped at, hey, it can list it, let's just report this, call it a day, and continue on looking for actual bugs that we would be able to use in the competition, which is the story that Thijs has shared a while back. And that was it for us. We were done. We went back home after Tokyo, and a few days later, we got this email, this marketing email from ChargePoint with the title of Unlocking the Full Potential for EV Charging Experience. And I dare say, after all of this work with EV chargers and that particular last foray, we did indeed unlock the full potential of our EV chargers. So thank you very much for listening. This is indeed the end of our talk.